Green light's on. Okay. All right. You have probably, tone it down a bit. You have probably noticed this is not a map of Israel. All right. What Joe wanted me to do was talk about towns and cities in Israel. But I decided that to just do that, just go through a list of towns and cities, would be kind of dry. So I decided, being an engineer like I am, I've got to see the bigger picture first. So we're going to look at the bigger picture first. And I have this book at home. It was given to me by one of my father's aunts, 45 to 50 years ago. And I had used it for reference before, but I had never sat down and read it until recently. And it's really an enjoyable book. It's called the Bible Atlas. And what it does is it presents a series of maps and then has narrative to go along with each map about a certain period in Israel's history and what was going on in that period. And so I'm going to try to draw from that as best I can to go over some things about some cities and towns. But first of all, I want to build a background, and I want you to be, I'm going to read some verses first. I want you to be thinking about this question. Why did God place his people in what we call Israel today? I mean, remember after Noah and his family got off the ark, there was nobody on the whole earth. He could have put them anywhere he wanted to in the whole earth, but he chose this location. And I want you to be thinking about why you think that was so. But we're going to look at a couple verses, and Brian, will start with you. And I want you to read Psalm, I think it's 22. Verses 27 and 28.
Psalm 22, verse 27 and 28.
I can hear.
I'm loud enough. All the ends of the world shall remember and turn unto the Lord, and all the kindreds of the nations shall worship before thee. For the kingdom is the Lord's, and he is the governor among the nations.
Okay, remember that phrase. He's the governor among the nations. All right, Rachel, Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9.
When the Most High divided to the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of Adam, he set the bounds of the people according to the number of the children of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the lot of his inheritance.
All right, so when God decided where all the nations were going to dwell, what their boundaries were going to be, he based it on what he was going to do with Israel. All right, one more. And that is, next, Kathy. All right, Kathy, 1 Kings 8:53. Yes, please.
For you separated them from among all the peoples of the earth to be your heritage, as you declared through Moses your servant when you brought our fathers out of Egypt, O Lord God.
Okay, so he separated them from all the people of the earth. He set the bounds of the people of the earth according to what he's going to do with Israel, and he separated Israel from what he's going to do, or what he's going to do with them. All right, so back to our question. I want you to still think about that. I'm going to talk about something you're more familiar with probably, and that is Virginia. This is a topographic map of Virginia. And for those of you not familiar with how Virginia is laid out topographically, over to the east, they got what they call the coastal plain. And then in the middle, they have what's called the Piedmont area. And what separates the coastal plain from the Piedmont area is something they call the fall line. The fall line is in every river, Potomac, Rappahannock, York, and James. And it's a place where the land drops about 100 feet in about 6 miles. Over to the west of the Piedmont, you have the mountains. You have the Blue Ridge Mountains to the east, then you got the Shenandoah Valley in the middle, and then you got the Appalachian Mountains to the far west. All right, so the rainfall in all parts of Virginia is pretty close to the same. It ranges from 42 to 45 inches a year. Back, if you remember a couple years ago when it seemed like it was raining all the time, we got about 47, 48 inches of rain that year. Although the rainfall in Virginia is about the same throughout the state, you have different crops grown in different parts of the state. So, since the rainfall is about the same, why is there such a variety in what each area tends to grow? Elevation to some degree, there's something more important than that though. Soil type, right. The most fertile soils for grain crops are over to the east. Unfortunately, they ruined a lot of those soils with tobacco, but they still grow a lot of corn and soybeans over in the eastern part of the state, east of the fall line. In the middle, they don't grow grain crops so much. They grow other things, like Hanover is famous for its tomatoes, and down south, they're famous for their tobacco. And you'll see on the different maps. Over in the valley, the soil is, all right, the difference between the tidewater soils and the Piedmont soils is the Piedmont soils tend to have more clay in them. Over in the valley and the mountains, they don't, of course, grow much on the mountains, but in the valley, it's more limestone. And so it's not good for row crops, but they do grow cattle, both beef cattle and dairy cattle. They also grow a lot of orchards, although the number of orchards has decreased significantly since the 70s. Okay, so just notice that. So although Virginia has about the same amount of rainfall in all parts of the state, different things do better in different parts of the state, primarily because of soil type. All right, so this is a topographic map of Israel. Israel is a lot smaller landmass than Virginia, but it's got many, many types of soil in this small area. You got the Jordan Valley, you got the hills just to the west of the Jordan Valley, and then you got the coastal plain over to the far west. The rainfall in such a small area is very different depending on where you are in the country of Israel. From the red is very dry. It's like 100 milliliters of rain per year. 100 milliliters, who knows what that is in English? about 3 inches, 3 to 4 inches. Not much. All right, then further north, you work up to about 500 millimeters a year, which is about 18, 19 inches. So you got a big difference in the rainfall in the land. So the reason I'm pointing that out is because we've been talking about the inheritance by lot of the different tribes. And don't think that each tribe got a small section of the same type of area. The areas that they got were very different from one another. And that's probably why the prophecies about the way the future of each tribe was significantly different. Down in the south, they can't grow what they can grow in the north. This is down in the south, is because of the slight rainfall, it tends to be mostly desert. But we'll get into that in a minute. All right, so what do they grow? I forgot my sheet, but anyway, they grow. Hang on just a minute. I wrote this all down. All right, this is modern Israel, what they do with the land, but there's little small patches of blue. They are fish ponds. They grow fish. The red is where they have greenhouses. The green is where they have orchards. That would be your fig trees and olives. And then the gray over on the coast near Gaza is just fields, grain crops. And then in the south, they don't grow anything. So that's what they grow today. So when God said you're getting vineyards and olive yards that you didn't plant, he's not talking about the whole land. He's just talking about part of it. Okay, that's the last slide. Okay. All right, so knowing that you got a land full of differences, rainfall, very different, what you can grow is very different. He could have put them anywhere in the world he wanted to put them. Why did he pick this area? It's not a big area, but it's got some significance to it. Does anybody? How is it strategic? Yeah, huge climate changes in just a small area. No, it is. You're on the right track. I want you to back up in history. Put that same thought in Old Testament times. Why would that be important, that it be the connector between Asia, Europe, Africa? What back then made it the connector? What tied those three continents together?
Like trade routes?
Trade routes, yes. And you got trade routes. Let me see if I can go back to one of the other maps. Bigger. You got trade routes in Israel in two places. You got, do we have a laser? Yeah, we do. Okay. Trying to figure out where it is. There we go. Okay. Over on the coast, you've got what they call the Way of the Sea. And that would be the main route from Egypt up into the northern part. You know what kingdom was in the northern part, what we call Turkey? Somebody had a large kingdom back then. You don't know. It was the Hittites. Hittites had a significant kingdom in Turkey and their kingdom actually extended into Syria. All right, down south, okay, sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, then over to the east more is what they call the King's Highway. And that would have gone from Egypt to Mesopotamia. It would go up to the headwaters of the Euphrates River and then head east over to Mesopotamia. So you got two major trade routes going right through this land that God places people in. So to think, we read that verse in 1 Kings about he separated them from all the people of the earth. But to think that they were isolated from all the people of the earth, you're totally wrong. They had all kinds of contact with people from other nations through the trade routes. Remember, Joseph was sold to the Ishmaelites and Midianites. They were traders going down into Egypt. All right. All right, so he wanted them to be a holy people. He wanted them to follow his way. So why would he put them where they would be vulnerable to all these people from other nations, vulnerable to their thinking, vulnerable to their worship? Why would he put them in this location where they're so exposed to all these other peoples?
In 1948, they fought a three-front war, as a new country and won, so there's one example of showing that God is their true deliverer, not anything else or them alone. And he works with the weakest of circumstances and shows that doesn't matter.
Good. Okay. Casey?
They would also be in the perfect location to be a lampstand to the rest of the world.
All right.
And to be tested.
And to be tested, okay. So you got, he's their deliverer, no matter how many enemies they're exposed to. There can be a lampstand to all these nations that they're exposed to. All right, Walter wants to say something.
And remember, we're looking at modern Israel. The new Israel will be much larger than this space and further north and reach more up the great, from the great river Egypt all the way up to Euphrates. So there's even more of those same things that he has in mind for them to have. And you're right, the key was for them to be the light, that everybody passing through would see their God. Remember how all the other nations say, man, how powerful their God is. We defeat ours, they wanted his.
I think it's also, tag on to that, I think like King David almost got that entire kingdom, like he almost conquered that entire kingdom, and it's followed up by his son. You know that the source of all of the wealth that came in is from God, but it did set up the nation of Israel to be like really a trade epicenter after that time.
David extended the kingdom all the way to the headwaters of the Euphrates down to the what they call the river of Egypt. And Solomon, when he became king, he started out with it that big. So now, back then, they only had the trade routes. They did have ships. Probably the most famous trade done by ships was the Phoenicians. Phoenicians took their lumber from their cedars of Lebanon and took it down to Egypt so Egypt could build houses with wood. Egypt didn't have any wood of their own, so they were very interested in getting wood from Phoenicia. But most of the trade was done by camel through the trade routes. All right, so God set his people there. Now, even with airlines, even with modern ships, still Israel is looked at as a key point in the earth. And in the future, as Walter was saying, when the house of prayer is built in Jerusalem, it's going to be even more of a key point in the earth. And I think it's still significant that it's between, they call it the land bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa. And it's still significant that that is true, even though we've got all these modern forms of transportation. All right. Anybody have any more they want to say? Because I'm going to move on to something else.
To amass all of those people there, they'll be able to come by ship, they'll be able to come by airplane, they'll be able to come by land. So, not many places can say that can happen, that all those people could amass for that great of a conflict that quickly and to be that grand of a scale, probably almost overnight, really.
And you bring up an important point that I forgot to bring up, and that is that these roads, the Way of the Sea and the King's Highway, they weren't just roads for traders. They were roads for armies. And yeah, they have found that the Egyptians would protect their country from invasion from the north. They put a line of fortresses up into particularly the Gaza area. They found the ruins of these fortresses about 5 to 10 years ago. And the Hittites had fortresses in Syria to, again, keep people out of their kingdom as well. And then over to the east, you had the Babylonian, Syrian Peninsula. All right, so it was Israel, although they were to be a separate people, they were going to be exposed to a lot of armies marching north and south. And sometimes, as in the case of Josiah, they got in trouble for trying to ally themselves with some of those armies. They were supposed to depend on God, as Rob said, and to be a separate people. All right, so God brings Abraham into the area first. He brings him up. I don't have a map to show you, but he brings him up the Tigris, Euphrates rivers, and then down south along the coast into the Promised Land. Who was there? What was the civilization like back then? when Abraham came through. Well, as I mentioned before, you've got the Hittites up in Turkey, Syria area. You've got the Egyptians down south. And over in the Mesopotamian area, you've got what they call the Sumerians. Now, the Bible doesn't talk about the Sumerians, but they were a significant people, probably just before the time of Abraham, but they were in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley near what we call Babylon. Now, what was their contribution to civilization? First of all, they made irrigation canals and dikes so that they could grow food. They had buildings and walls were made of mud. They didn't have stone in that area, so they made them of dried mud, bricks. They were the first people to use the arch and the first people to use the wheel. And they used the wheel both for pottery wheels and for transportation. They were the first people to alloy tin with copper and make bronze to make stronger tools. And then they were also skilled in mathematics. They built a numbering system based on 10s and 60s. And from them, we get our way of keeping time with the hour and minute and second and the 360-degree circle. They developed a kind of writing called cuneiform, which just looks like wedges in the clay. And then in their writing, they had an account of a great flood that destroyed mankind. All right, that was the Sumerians. They were over in the area, Euphrates area. All right, down south, you had the Egyptians, who were also a strong people. The Egyptians had fertile soil in the delta, which I don't have a map of, which is right next to the Mediterranean Sea. And in that delta, they grew vegetables, fruit, flax, and grapes. You remember when the Israelites were complaining in the wilderness that they didn't have leeks and onions and garlic anymore. This is where the Israelites had lived in that delta area where they could grow these things. Also in Goshen, which is near the peninsula, the Egyptians raised sheep, goats, and cattle. They had structures of stone, not brick, and they built huge monuments of stone. They were the first to have a solar calendar, and their calendar was based on 360 days, which is 12 months of 30 days, and they had 5 feast days that they added to that to get 365. They were very skilled, the Egyptians were very skilled in surgery, in medicine, and they learned a lot about anatomy by mummifying their dead people. And their writing was not cuneiform, but they wrote in hieroglyphics. And I just read recently an article on, anybody remember the Rosetta Stone? All right, what do you know about the Rosetta Stone, Rob? Jason said he knows.
This is on record. What do you know?
Not much.
All right, Jason said he knows. Jason. Oh, Casey, you know? Okay, go ahead.
Well, I think it's what was used to, it was some sort of ability, it gave the ability to translate hieroglyphics.
Right?
It was the same message delivered on 3 different sides in 3 different languages that allowed you to corroborate what one language was saying so that they could finally decipher what hieroglyphics were.
Right. That stone enabled them to decode hieroglyphics to a large extent. And what they found was they found that hieroglyphics, the symbols were not always words. Sometimes they were parts of words or syllables. Sometimes they were just sounds. So they had to figure all this out. And they also found out or figured out that the language in the middle between the Greek and the hieroglyphics was not a different language. It was just a simpler form of hieroglyphics. So, but it was two men particularly that worked on this, and it did allow them to what they call decode hieroglyphics so they could then understand hieroglyphics. Anyway, through the hieroglyphics, they learned that the Egyptians wrote medical journals, and they were quite skilled in medicine. All right, so between, Adam, you want me to quit? All right, between Egypt and the Sumerians, you got Canaan, the Canaanites. And the Canaanites grew what they grew when Israel came through. They grew fields, orchards, vineyards, because they were not dependent on the flooding of a river. They were dependent on rainfall. And as we showed you, the rainfall varied a lot depending on where you were in the land. They never had a united kingdom as the Sumerians and Egyptians did. They had little small kingdoms. And that was a real advantage to the Israelites when they were coming out of Egypt. They didn't have to fight a massive army. They just had to fight several small armies. You mentioned the trade routes. The Canaan area was originally just wandering shepherds, and then some of them settled down and planted some crops. As I mentioned, the Egyptians had some forts over in the Gaza area. All right, the only thing I didn't mention was that the primary religion of the Sumerians over in Mesopotamia was the worship of the moon god. And so that's the culture that Abraham came out of. And I think even his father, it said his father worshiped foreign gods as well. All right, so that's the background, and I'll stop there. What we're going to try to do is paint a picture of the different towns and cities as much as you're willing to delve into this subject, rather than just talk dryly about different ones. We're going to try to paint a bigger picture. All right, I'll stop it there. They developed very in a short couple hundred years or something, yeah. What was it, about 500 years between the flood and Abraham? Something like that? There was said to be that Shem could have been Melchizedek. I haven't heard that. So yeah, it wouldn't have been a long time. All right.
They'd rather have you up here.